My son called me on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after my 64th birthday, to wish me happy birthday, and then, in the same breath, asked whether I'd gotten around to signing the investment forms he'd mailed me the week before. I told him the forms could wait. Then I hung up the phone, sat with my coffee going cold on the kitchen counter, and called my attorney to ask how quickly we could revoke a power of attorney. By that evening, my son had called me 43 times. Let me back up, because the devil is always in the details. I'm 64 years old. I taught elementary school for 31 years in Sarasota, Florida, and when I retired, my husband and I finally had the life we'd been quietly postponing. Morning walks on the beach, weekend drives up to Tarpon Springs, late dinners on the back porch with the ceiling fan going and the sound of the neighborhood settling around us. We weren't wealthy people. My husband worked in commercial insurance, and we built what we had carefully over decades. When he passed 4 years ago from a sudden cardiac event, a Thursday afternoon, I was in the produce section at Publix when my phone rang. He left me the house on Magnolia Terrace, a modest investment portfolio, and about $580,000 in savings. Comfortable, not extravagant, enough that I didn't have to worry, as long as I was sensible. My son Seth was 41 years old and had never quite been sensible. I say that with all the love in the world, and also with the hindsight of a woman who has finally learned to call a thing what it is. Seth had his father's charm and his own version of his father's ambitions, except his father had actually built something with those ambitions, and Seth mostly collected them like hobbies he'd eventually lose interest in. There was the consulting firm he started at 35 that never got off the ground. The real estate license he got at 37 and used twice. The investment group he joined at 39 that I still don't fully understand. He had a gift for sounding like he had a plan. His wife Monica was 37, sharp and pretty and relentless in the quiet way that certain women are relentless. She'd been a marketing coordinator when they met and stopped working when their daughter Grace was born. 15 now, with her father's charm and, I've come to believe, a much better compass than either of her parents. Their son Cole was 12 and still figuring out who he was, which is exactly where a 12-year-old should be. After my husband died, my son started coming around more. At first it was touching. He'd call every few days, come down to Sarasota on weekends, sit with me at the kitchen table the way he hadn't since college. I thought grief had softened him. I thought this was the version of my son I'd always hoped would emerge. I made his favorite meals and told him things I'd never told anyone else, and believed, truly believed, that his father's death had brought us back to each other. What it had actually done was make him aware of the numbers on my bank statements. Looking back, I can trace the shift almost to the month. About a year after the funeral, the visits started feeling more purposeful. My son would mention in passing that the property taxes were coming up, that the HVAC system in my house was getting old, that it might be worth rebalancing my investments. He'd send me articles. He'd offer to make calls on my behalf. I kept telling him I had an attorney who handled those things, and he'd nod and say, of course, but next month there'd be another suggestion, another offer to help that felt a half step too eager. The power of attorney conversation happened last January, 2 days after I came home from having my hip replaced. I was in bed with a heating pad and a foggy head from the pain medication when my son sat down beside me and said he'd been worried about my recovery. He said that if anything happened, a fall, a reaction to the medication, if I was simply too out of it to manage things for a few weeks, he wanted to make sure my affairs were covered. He had a form. A durable power of attorney, he said, covering financial matters. He said the hospital social worker had mentioned it as something families should have in place. I don't know if the hospital social worker said any such thing. I've never been able to verify it. What I know is that I was on pain medication. My hip felt like it was full of broken glass, and my son was sitting next to me looking concerned and responsible, and I signed. I didn't read it carefully. I know. The next 3 months were quiet. My son called every week or so, asked about physical therapy, seemed genuinely interested. My daughter-in-law texted occasionally. Grace sent me videos she thought I'd enjoy, most of which I didn't fully understand but appreciated anyway. Cole sent me a drawing of a sea turtle he'd done in art class that I framed and put on my nightstand. My birthday fell on a Saturday. I turned 64. I made myself a pot of the Guatemalan blend from the little shop downtown, sat on my back porch watching the herons in the yard, and told myself it was fine, that 64 was just a number, that I didn't need a fuss. I had lunch with my neighbor Alice at our usual place on the bay. By 8 o'clock that evening, no one in my son's household had called. Grace sent a text at 9:15. "Happy B-Day! Grandma! And I held the phone in both hands and thought about how that small message from a 15-year-old was the only acknowledgement I'd gotten from my own family, and I decided not to think about it too hard, because if I thought about it too hard, I would cry, and I had already cried enough in the 4 years since my husband died. My son called on Tuesday morning. My birthday had been Saturday. "Mom, happy birthday! Sorry things have been so crazy. You know how it is. Hey, while I have you, did you get those investment forms I mailed last week? The quarterly rebalancing paperwork? If you just sign and send them back, I can handle everything else through the POA, so you don't even have to worry about it." I don't know exactly what made me pause. Maybe it was the casual way the two things were joined together. Birthday wishes, 3 days late. And by the way, the documents. Maybe it was the phrase, "handle everything else." Maybe it was simply 4 years of small things that hadn't quite added up, finally adding up all at once. I told him the forms could wait. I hung up and called my attorney. When I asked him to read me exactly what the power of attorney covered, he went quiet, for a moment, before he answered. "It covers a broad scope of financial transactions," he said. "Bank accounts, investment accounts, real property." "Real property," I repeated. "Your house on Magnolia would be included, yes." I sat very still. I looked at the herons standing in my backyard, with the patience of something that has never once been fooled. "How quickly can we revoke it?" He said by end of week. I told him I needed it by tomorrow. He made it happen. "I want to tell you something about the next few days that I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from what someone has done, but from understanding what they've been thinking." My son hadn't taken anything. Not yet. But he'd been looking at what was mine in a way I couldn't unknow, and that knowledge sat in my chest like something that didn't fit there. I didn't tell him I'd revoke the document. Instead, I called Alice. Alice had known me for 22 years. We'd met when our children were in the same elementary school, reconnected as neighbors when my husband and I moved to Magnolia Terrace, and kept each other company through more than one hard season. She was the person I'd called when my husband's diagnosis first came back, before I'd told anyone else, because I needed to hear a voice I could trust without having to explain why. I told her what I was thinking. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Cynthia, I've been meaning to call you about something. I wasn't sure if it was my place." I told her it was her place. 2 weeks earlier, Alice had run into my daughter-in-law at the nail salon on Osprey. They'd chatted for a few minutes. My daughter-in-law had mentioned, in that offhand way she had of mentioning things, that they were starting to think long-term about Sarasota. When Alice asked what she meant, she said something about how it didn't make sense for a woman my age to be maintaining a 3-bedroom house on her own, and that when I eventually moved somewhere more manageable, the property would rent beautifully. When I eventually moved somewhere more manageable. I thanked Alice. I finished my coffee. Then I called my attorney again. I told him to review every transaction made against my accounts in the past 6 months. He said he'd get back to me by Thursday. He called Wednesday afternoon. There had been 3 withdrawals from my savings account: $200, $350, $420, spaced about 6 weeks apart, each attributed to a payee listed only as a set of initials. The authorization had been made using the power of attorney credentials my son held. Small amounts, testing the water. I sat with that information until my hands stopped shaking. Then I thought about my daughter-in-law, standing in a nail salon, discussing my house, in the past tense while I was still living in it. And the shaking got worse before it got better. I was going to need a plan. Before I finished making one, I got a text from an unfamiliar number. I recognized it. Grace had texted me from her friend's phone once before when her battery had died. "Grandma, can you call me on this number? I need to tell you something, but not from my phone." I called immediately. Her voice was low, careful, like she was in another room away from someone. "Grandma, yesterday there was a man at your house. Mom and Dad drove us by it, and there was a man outside walking around, looking at the yard. I heard Dad call him a friend from the neighborhood, but then I saw them shaking hands, and the man took pictures of the front of the house on his phone. Dad gave me a look when he saw me watching." She paused. "You know the look." I knew the look she meant. "Grace," I said, "you did exactly the right thing calling me. Are you okay?" I told her I was working on it. That night, I went through every piece of paper my son had ever handed me to sign. Tucked into the back of a folder I'd thought contained only insurance forms was a single-page document redirecting the automatic dividend payments from my investment account to a secondary account number I didn't recognize. It was signed with what was supposed to be my signature. It was not my signature. I stared at it for a long time. Then I called my attorney and told him we had a problem considerably larger than an overly broad power of attorney. What happened next I planned carefully, because I spent 31 years managing 28 children at a time, and I know that if you raise your voice, you lose the room. You have to be ahead of them before they know you're moving. My attorney documented everything: the unauthorized withdrawals, the forged signature, the revocation of the power of attorney, the real estate inquiry. My own doctor wrote a letter confirming was in full cognitive health. I sat with all of it, organized in a folder on my kitchen table. And then I called my son and told him I was thinking of updating some paperwork and would love it if he and his wife could come down to Sarasota for the weekend. He said, of course, he'd been meaning to come anyway. They arrived Saturday afternoon with a bottle of wine I recognized from the discount rack at the Total Wine on Tamiami. They were careful with me in the way they'd recently become careful, attentive, gentle, my daughter-in-law asking about my hip, my son offering to look at the HVAC. We had dinner, they stayed the night, and Sunday morning I made pancakes the way Grace loves them, which was maybe the only part of the whole weekend that wasn't strategic. After breakfast, I set the folder on the table. "I want to talk about something," I said. My son looked at the folder the way a man looks at something he recognizes, but doesn't want to admit recognizing. I told them I knew about the 3 withdrawals. I told them I knew about the real estate agent. I told them about the document with a signature that wasn't mine. My daughter-in-law went the color of old paper. My son opened his mouth, then closed it. "That's not what he started." "Don't," I said, not loudly, the way I used to say it across a classroom when I needed a child to understand that the conversation we were about to have required honesty. "I've had everything verified. I have copies. I'm not asking you to explain it to me right now. I'm telling you what I know." What followed was not a clean or composed conversation. My son cried. Not the calculated kind, but the ugly, gasping kind that a person can't entirely choose. He said they were drowning. He said the consulting business had been losing money for 2 years. He said my daughter-in-law's anxiety about money had become something that ran their household in ways he hadn't been able to admit to anyone. He said he'd told himself he was only protecting assets that would eventually be his, anyway, which is the kind of reasoning a desperate person builds like a house of cards and pretends is load-bearing. My daughter-in-law didn't cry. She sat very still and looked at the table and said, eventually and quietly, that her own parents had lost everything when she was 12. Bankruptcy, their home, everything gone before she was old enough to understand why, and that the fear of that happening again had become the thing she organized her whole life around without ever quite meaning to. I don't say this to excuse what she did. I say it because it was the truth, and the truth mattered to me even then. The document with the forged signature is fraud, I said. You both know that. My son nodded. He couldn't look at me. Here is what I'm offering you, once. I laid it out clearly. He would sign a full accounting of every transaction made under the power of attorney. He would repay the withdrawn amounts to my account within 30 days. He would meet with a financial counselor, not an investment advisor, not someone who would help them find more creative ways to spend money they didn't have, but a counselor who works with people on debt and spending. Within 60 days, and he would give my attorney confirmation that he'd done so. The forged document would be turned over to my attorney to be held. Not filed with anyone. Not reported. Held, unless anything like this ever happened again in any form. In exchange, I would not press criminal charges. And the house, my daughter-in-law asked. Her voice was very flat. The house is mine, I said. I live in it. I intend to continue living in it. If I ever choose to sell it or leave it to someone when I die, I will make that decision myself. Is that understood? It was understood. They left that afternoon without the wine. My son hugged me at the door for a long time, longer than he had in years. And I let him because he is still my son, and some part of me will always be the woman who walked him to his first day of kindergarten and stood on the sidewalk watching him go through those big double doors. But I watched him drive away with my eyes open. The months that followed were not a movie version of reconciliation. They were slow and sometimes uncomfortable and occasionally backslid before correcting again. My son took a position as a regional coordinator for a logistics company. Steady salary. Nothing glamorous. Benefits he'd stopped being too proud for. My daughter-in-law began seeing a therapist who worked specifically with financial anxiety, which I think turned out to be the most useful thing that happened to either of them. They sold one of their cars and moved Grace private school she'd been attending since 6th grade to the private school high schools, to the public high school 2 miles from their house. Grace handled the change without complaint. She told me on the phone that she hadn't loved the old school anyway because everyone there cared too much about the wrong things. She's 15. I think she is going to be absolutely fine. At Christmas, they came to Sarasota for 4 days. My son cooked most of the meals, which he'd been apparently teaching himself to do since they'd cut the dining out budget, and which he was, honestly, and to my genuine surprise, not bad at. On Christmas Eve, after the kids had gone to bed, he and I sat on the back porch with the ceiling fan, going the way my husband and I used to, and he talked for a long time about his father, about who he'd wanted to be and how he'd gotten lost somewhere in the distance between wanting and doing. I listened. I didn't offer solutions. That wasn't what he needed from me that night. Before he went to bed, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a personal check for the full amount that had been taken from my account. $970 total, and a handwritten note that said only, "I'm sorry. I'm trying." I put the check in my banking folder. I put the note in my nightstand, next to the drawing of the sea turtle Cole made me 2 Christmases ago. 6 months after that Sunday morning at my kitchen table, Alice and I were having lunch at our usual place on the bay, watching the boats come in. And she asked me whether I thought people really changed or whether they eventually went back to being exactly who they'd always been. I sat with the question for a while before I answered. I said I thought most people carry more than one version of themselves at the same time, and that the version my son, had been operating from for too long was the frightened one, the one that looked at love and saw only what it could secure. I said I didn't know yet. Which version of him would win out in the end? I said I had stopped arranging my own life around the hope that it would be the better one, but that I was still, genuinely, hoping. Alice said that sounded about right. I drove home to my house on Magnolia Terrace, the one I have no intention of leaving anytime soon. And I sat on my back porch and watched the herons in the yard, and drank the good coffee, the Guatemalan blend. And I thought about my husband and how he used to sit in the chair beside mine and say almost nothing for long stretches of time, in the easy, companionable way of someone who has nothing to prove. I thought about how long I'd spent mistaking generosity for love, in giving it and in accepting it in return. There is a version of this story where I kept signing things and didn't call Alice and didn't trust my own hesitation on that Tuesday morning, and I try not to think about where that version ends. This version ends here, on my porch, in the afternoon light, with a cup of coffee that's mine, and a house that's mine, and a life that I am finally, after 4 long years, living for myself. Not because I stopped loving my son, but because I finally understood that protecting myself and loving him were never the same problem, and I had spent far too long treating them as if they were. Have you ever had to make a decision like this one? If you've been through something similar, or you know someone who has, I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a comment and tell me where you're watching from.